My name is Matt Gherkin. I'm here representing American Philanthropic. We are a consulting firm that assists many Catholic clients with fundraising services and assists philanthropists with strategic planning. And we are happy to count Chris Fisher and the Portsmouth Institute as one of our clients. Tonight our topic is papal economics. We'll have two speakers this evening who will each have 20 minutes, followed by a 20-minute period for questions and answers. It's easy for us in America to see global economics segregated into two clear categories, capitalism and socialism. But is that necessarily the case? Is that the only way at looking at economics? Is the Catholic Church compatible with either of those economic systems? Most modern popes have been widely critical of both, from Leo XIII's encyclical Rerum Novarum to the Soviet-busting St. John Paul II to the social justice crusader Pope Francis. Our evening panel tonight will discuss the tradition of papal economics and how Pope Francis specifically has interpreted, amended, or transformed that economic vision. Tonight's discussion will put in center stage two alternative readings of the history of papal teaching on economics. Our two contributors will take two different sides in this discussion, and I hope that I will not have to move to the seat in between them to keep them from fighting. So our two speakers tonight. Cliff Hobbins is a teacher in the history department right here at Portsmouth Abbey School. Prior to coming to Portsmouth Abbey, Cliff taught at Gould Academy in Bethel, Maine, and was dean and department head of history at Freiburg Academy in Freiburg, Maine. If you want to know which perspective he will represent in this discussion, consider a quick story. Writer, professor, and investor Michael Mauboussin, a 1982 graduate of the Abbey and chief U.S. investment strategist for Credit Suisse First Boston, sent Cliff a signed copy of his first book on investment strategy, giving him credit and thanking him for, quote, turning me on to economics. Elizabeth Stoker Bruenig is a staff writer at the New Republic, where she writes on ethics, politics, culture, and Christianity. Her writings have also appeared in such varied magazines as The Atlantic, The Boston Review, Al Jazeera America, Jacobin, America, First Things, the Los Angeles Review of Books, The American Conservative, The Daily Beast, The Nation, and Salon. So there's really nowhere she hasn't published a piece, no matter how far left or right. I want to repeat Jacobin and The American Conservative. Bruenig is currently a PhD student studying religion and politics at Brown University, and she will lead us off.
Thank you all so much for being with us tonight. It's true. I have written everywhere, far left and far right, because when you are someone who is called a pro-life liberal, there's nowhere for you. So you just sort of wedge in wherever you can find an opening. I want to thank you again for joining us tonight to talk about Pope Francis' contributions to our understanding of economics. I'm thrilled to be talking with you all, especially grateful to Chris Fisher and Portsmouth Abbey Institute for putting this conference together. Chris has been really indispensable. I'm sure half the huge number of emails he's answered in the last couple of weeks came from me, and I want to recognize all he's done for putting this together. So thank you, Chris. And I hope you have all enjoyed your time here. I expect the contributions made here, especially in light of Laudato Si coming out earlier this week, will help advance dialogue about Pope Francis' papacy inside and outside the Church. I'm honored to share a speaking schedule with friends and colleagues and mentors that I respect tremendously, and trust by the end of the conference we'll go forward with a developed and nuanced set of insights into Pope Francis' tenure as Pope so far. With this talk, I'm aiming to establish two ideas. First, that there is an extraordinary misunderstanding of Pope Francis' economics that's largely the result of peculiar American historical tendencies in politics. And then secondly, that Pope Francis' economics represent the most faithful, reasoned approach to contemporary global economic problems. I will begin with the first effort, that is, untangling the confusion surrounding Pope Francis' economics. There's a good amount of legitimate controversy surrounding Pope Francis, and most of it's related to tone and delivery, and these are not small matters. But there's also, equally, in my view, a huge amount of controversy surrounding Pope Francis that's totally illegitimate. What controversy am I referring to? Let me share a few headlines with you from the past couple of years. The Economist accuses Pope Francis of following Lenin, from the Religion News Service. Marxists celebrate Pope Francis, from Breitbart. Is the Pope a communist? From the BBC. Pope Francis, a socialist by any other name, from BeliefNet. And it's kind of the wild card, but one of my favorites. Pope Francis, a liberal Machiavelli, from the American Conservative. So there you have it. The Pope of the Roman Catholic Church is not only a socialist, but a communist, not only a communist, but a Leninist, not only a Leninist, but a liberal one, and maybe a Machiavellian one. And this is an extremely perplexing set of labels to settle on the shoulder of a man who John L. Allen estimated would call himself a moderate Peronist if he was asked, and more befuddling litany of charges for someone who has shown no signs of any such affiliations. And yet, I doubt this odd media habit will cease anytime soon. It's the result of a confusion in terms that situated itself in the marrow of American partisan politics. The American political imagination is deeply confined by our parties. We imagine one party to be liberal, the other conservative. Any idea that integrates economic principles typical of the Democratic Party is automatically described as liberal, and any idea, heaven forbid, that integrates economic principles more radical than those typical of the Democratic Party are automatically described as Marxism, communism, socialism, something like that. Because we only have two parties and thus no socialist or communist partisan presence, that is, you don't have ads run on TV by the Socialist Party of America or Communist Party of America, which is typical of some European parliamentary democracies, Americans tend to have a pretty weak understanding of what socialism actually is. That is, the workers owning the means of production or state-controlled economies. It's typically just used to describe things that are kind of further left than Democrats like to be. The term is applied pretty loosely, in other words. The reality is that both Republicans and Democrats are fundamentally liberal. They are, and let me emphasize, theoretically, seeking to maximize citizens' liberties. They disagree mainly on how best to go about that. Both highly esteem self-determination, individual rights, and personal freedoms. These inclinations play out in a variety of spheres, some of them social, some of them economic. Without getting into the particulars of liberalism, and with the intent to restrict my comments to economics, it will suffice to say that economic liberalism is a modern innovation with a modern view of the human person, while the Catholic Church is an institution that maintains much continuity with pre-modern thought and has a very different view of the human person and his place in creation. Where liberal economic thought centers individual freedom, the Catholic approach to economics embraces personalism, a philosophy that considers the human person the primary unit of moral concern and aims to promote human flourishing. Pope St. John Paul II was incidentally one of the great architects of personalism, along with several other guys who are much more obscure, Jacques Maritain, and so on. Pope Francis' continuation of his work, therefore, represents anything but a radical rupture with the Church's past. It's a great continuation. Freedom and liberty are part of our Catholic consideration of human flourishing, but they fit into a matrix of values that support people as we journey toward flourishing, which is living oriented to God. It is this central interest to live lives oriented toward God that preoccupies Christian ethics and accordingly Christian economics. This sets our approach apart from the liberal approach and explains, as I hope to demonstrate, the points of departure between Pope Francis and his mainly American detractors. The word economy comes to us from the Greek oikonomia, meaning roughly household management or household stewardship. The Apostle Paul uses the term with some frequency in his letters to refer to his carrying out of the tasks that God has assigned him. The Orthodox Church uses the term in a similar way to refer to the application of church canons to the daily life of the church, just daily goings-on. These uses, though different than our contemporary use of the word, are illuminating for two reasons. Firstly, because they remind us that economics is a matter of household management, that is, a matter of rightly ordering the use of our common home. Secondly, because they help situate the place of economics in the Church's social teaching. Robert Vischer explains that Catholic social teaching is, by nature, ill-suited to abstract formulation. It can be understood only through exploration in the context of pressing social problems in which it's developed, as underscored by the Church's consistent and deliberate recitation of relevant real-world circumstances in tandem with invocations of the theoretical principles on which the social teaching is based. With regard to economics, then, Catholic social teaching aims to provide moral guidance on the question of how we should manage resources in our present circumstances. The Church's teachings concerning contingent situations are subject to new and further developments and can be open to discussion, Pope Francis writes in Evangelii Gaudium. Yet we cannot help but be concrete, lest the great social problems remain mere generalities, which challenge no one. To understand the contributions Pope Francis has made along these lines, we must consider the broad principles underlying his thought and then put them in the context of the real-world problems we face today. First, the broad principles. Pope Francis, in keeping with the whole of our tradition, views creation as intended for humanity. Nothing in this world is indifferent to us, he writes in Laudato Si. Humankind was made for stewardship of the earth, a task that belongs to all people in common. Accordingly, all of creation is given to humankind in common. From sin comes the fall, from the fall scarcity, and more crucially, the human inability to reliably treat common goods as such. Augustine supposed the introduction of governance, though ultimately a result of sin, was a gift from God meant to remedy this situation. Where men could no longer reliably regulate their own impulses, fair governance, which is an important part of Augustine's thought, had a better shot at preventing constant antagonism between neighbors. In Augustine's view, the regulation of private property was one such function of government. God has made the rich and poor of one clay. The same earth supports rich and poor alike. But by human right, however, someone says, this estate is mine, this house is mine, this slave is mine. By human right, therefore, the right of emperors. Why? Because God has distributed mankind these human rights through the emperors and kings of this world. Augustine's insight here helps us distinguish between what the right intent of the institution of property is and how the institution itself works, the why and the how of private property, if you will. The intent of private property is to maintain the kind of order that leads to flourishing, that is, to allow all persons the security and stability we need to flourish. Meanwhile, the institution itself functions through various pieces of governance, regulation, and social control. Taken together, the why of private property tells us the moral parameters within which we must operate. In Laudato Si, Pope Francis writes, "The principle of the subordination of private property to the universal destination of goods, and thus the right of everyone to their use, is a golden rule of social conduct and the first principle of the whole ethical and social order. The Christian tradition has never recognized the right of private property as absolute or inviolable, and has stressed the social purpose of all forms of property. St. John Paul II forcefully reaffirmed this teaching, stating that God gave the earth to the whole of the human race for the sustenance of all its members, without excluding or favoring anyone." These are very strong words. Very strong words. They're perhaps less frightening than certain corners of the political commentariat would have you think. What Pope Francis is emphasizing here is that the institutions governing property relations must orient their work around the principle that all persons are inherently valuable and worthy of flourishing. It is on this count that Pope Francis has called for governments around the world to repair their broken systems of property distribution, their broken systems of distributing wealth. In applying these principles to our current economic situation, Pope Francis has found that poor people around the world are presently victims of an economy of an exclusion, an economy that kills. Just as the commandment, "Thou shalt not kill," sets a clear limit in order to safeguard the value of human life, today we also have to say, "Thou shalt not," to an economy of an exclusion and inequality. Such an economy kills, he writes in Evangelii Gaudium, going on to say that while the earnings of a minority are growing exponentially, so too is the gap separating the majority from the prosperity enjoyed by a happy few. Pope Francis views the opportunity and prosperity available only to a rarefied few as an example of our mismanagement of resources, a failure of oikonomia. In Evangelii Gaudium, he makes this much clearer, writing that the sufferings of the poor are a scandal in a time of such abundance. Pope Francis' vision for redress is not simply to attain a nourishment or dignified sustenance for all people, he writes, but also their general temporal welfare and prosperity. This means education, access to health care, and above all, participatory and mutually supportive labor that human beings express and enhance the dignity of their lives. A just wage, he writes, enables them to have adequate access to all the other goods which are destined for our common use. This is what Pope Francis means when he calls for a just distribution of goods. As we have seen, the Christian ethics of private property are entirely consonant with these projects, and our current circumstances require us to seek them. Since the 1970s, wages for the lowest income workers have stagnated and jobs have disappeared. The top 1% of American earners captured 95% of total market income growth in the last several years, and the wealthiest 1% of American families hold 40% of the nation's wealth. Meanwhile, the bottom 50% holds just 1% of the nation's wealth. Along with a variety of social ills, mistrust, crime, poor health, declining marriage rates, especially among the poor, inequality on this register is also correlated with corruption in government and pervasive social unrest. It is a cancer, in other words, that results from our failure to rightly manage God's gift to us, and it echoes through every dimension of our lives. In Laudato Si', Pope Francis identifies one source of our ongoing dilemma. Some circles maintain that current economic and technology will solve all environmental problems and argue, in popular and non-technical terms, that the problems of global hunger and poverty will be resolved simply by market growth. They show no interest in more balanced levels of production, a better distribution of wealth, concern for the environment, and rights of future generations. Yet, by itself, the market cannot guarantee integral human development and social inclusion. On the other hand, intelligent economic policy can go a long way towards improving the lives of our poorest, many of them families of children, especially young children. Consider the disparities between child poverty in high inequality countries, like the United States, and low inequality countries like the Scandinavian states. In the United States, more than 1 in 5 children are in poverty, while in top egalitarian countries like Denmark, less than 1 in 25 children are in poverty. High levels of child deprivation in the United States are indicated not just in relative measures, such as poverty rates, but also in absolute measures regarding how much disposable income these children's families have access to. According to the Luxembourg Income Study, the poorest U.S. children at the 5th percentile, have absolute disposable incomes level that are near the bottom of rich developed countries. In the mid-2000s, the period from which the latest comparable data is available, there were 14 countries whose poorest children had more income than our poorest children. Topping the list, Norway and Denmark's poorest children had 2 times and 1.8 times the amount of disposable income as U.S. children. These realities are the result of family welfare benefit policies aimed specifically at establishing an equitable distribution of resources for the common good. It is notable that these egalitarian social democracies are not full-blown state socialist countries. There is private capital aplenty in Scandinavia. Nor are the politics that ensure their just distribution of goods culturally flattening. Pope Francis has repeatedly stressed that he values the diverse cultures of the world, and policies aimed at reducing inequality and achieving an economy of inclusion need not have any impact on the aspects of American culture that make us unique and vibrant, and there are many. We have the resources, therefore, and we know what our obligations are. This is not merely a matter of state governance, it involves the social order as well. Nor should these charges be confused with the wholly separate matter of Christian charity, which concerns caritas, not oikonomia, just as a rule of thumb, though we have Latin and Greek at work there. Oikonomia is a matter of resource management. The economy is a matter of resource management. Charity is a separate matter. It's not about managing resources. It's relational and a lot of other things that could be said at another time on that very rich topic. But Pope Francis has emphasized, actually in a sermon last Tuesday, that charity is an entirely different moral obligation than humane resource management, where he praised both institutions but distinguished between them. We are not calling, in other words, for the state to absorb charity, not in 1,000 years. What Pope Francis has brought forth is our moral imperative to properly order our loves. It is good to value freedom, self-determination, liberty, and all the rest, but these values must fit into a matrix that ultimately exalts the person and seeks universal human flourishing. Therefore, these things cannot be idolized to the exclusion or harm of human persons, which is the situation we now find ourselves in. In Laudato, Pope Francis writes, "This vision of might makes right has engendered immense inequality, injustice, and acts of violence against the majority of humanity, since resources end up in the hands of the first comer and the most powerful, winner takes all. Completely at odds with this model are the ideals of harmony, justice, fraternity, and peace as proposed by Jesus." Pope Francis is correct in his analysis and his moral theology. His message is a gift to our hearts, and I pray it will be a light for our path. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Before I start, I would like to tell you a little story that happened about 20 years ago, right here at the Portsmouth Abbey in the summer. William F. Buckley Jr. came here for a retreat, and he was, after Mass, in the monastic calefactory, reading the New York Times, when our Abbot Matthew, came through and said, "Mr. Buckley, you're on retreat. Why in the world are you reading the New York Times?" And he said, "I am searching for heresies." That's a true story. He found them every day. But I do want to start my remarks with another true story. This happened this last fall, in October, in the classroom building. It was about 9:30 in the morning. I had the period off, and I was actually walking down the corridor to the administration building, and I noticed one of our Chinese students had a Chinese family in the corridor pointing out something. I walked by and I said, "Good morning." And she said, "Good morning." They said, "Good morning." I said, "Where are you from?" They said, "Shanghai." And all of a sudden this thought hit me. I said, "Do you have a second?" They said, "Yes." "Come with me." My room is right there, room 10. And in my room is a rather large picture of Deng Xiaoping. And I said, "Do you know why there's a picture?" And they were very pleased. And they said, "No." I said, "Because in one generation, he got 450 million people out of poverty." And the woman said to me, "Ah, yes, Deng. If it wasn't for Deng, we wouldn't be here this morning." I never forgot it. So how did that happen? 450 million people. Well, this is not a weekend about Deng Xiaoping, but it's an interesting story. But I would just very, very rapidly, just a little bit about the modern history of the Catholic Church and economics. Certainly the man that was critical was the 19th century Catholic Bishop von Kettler, who is known as the father of modern Catholic social theory. All right. The man who took von Kettler was, of course, Leo XIII, and I suspect Leo XIII is the man who saved the Catholic Church. Without getting into a lot of nonsense, let us just say that Pius IX, let's say, was unfortunate in many ways as far as the modern world goes. But Leo XIII understood. And of course, in 1891, his famous encyclical Rerum Novarum was the first time, really, that the Catholic Church had said in a papal encyclical that a just wage for a just day's work. All right. Then there was Pius XI in his Quadragesimo Anno encyclical in 1931, in which he took von Kettler's idea of subsidiarity. And this is kind of rich. If I don't know where Thomas Jefferson is tonight, I wish him well, but I don't think he would appreciate what I'm going to say. But what subsidiarity said was exactly what Thomas Jefferson said, namely, that government is best which governs least. That's where we have our freedom. That's where we have our responsibilities. And Pius XI in Quadragesimo Anno, very quietly, because the Nazis were right on the verge of power and Mussolini was in power, but there was. Then I feel personally that in 1991, St. John Paul's Centesimus Annus was absolutely fundamental. And there were a lot of noses out of joint when that came out, and there have been a lot of noses out of joint ever since. But he came out and said, capitalism is the way to go. If you have a democratic polity, and if you have a vibrant moral culture, the three go. he said, that's the way to go. And I'm not going to get into the whole, if you haven't ever read it, please do. But he said two things that absolutely floored me in that encyclical. The first, he said, beside the earth, man's principal resource is man himself. And then he said, wealth creation today has more to do with human creativity and imagination than with political and economic systems. And it's that imagination and that creativity which is capable of unleashing the creative justice that the world needs. That was St. John Paul II. All right. Now, basically and fundamentally, in the world, and I think here is, and I'm just going to say this and then I'm going to come back to it. But when you get right down to it, in economics, there are only two ways you can go. You can redistribute from the haves to the have-nots, or you can produce more. Now, there are all kinds of nuances to that. I only have 20 minutes, but when it comes down to it, that's all you can do. Indeed, Robert Heilbroner, in his wonderful book, The Worldly Philosophers, says that in the whole history of the world, there have been only three ways that you can do economics. One is through tradition. I go to my job because my grandfather went to that job, and my father went to that job, and my son will go to that job. The second is the whip of central authority. You will go and do the work, or and that can do dramatically strong things in the short and medium term, not very good in the long term. And the third is the magic of the market, where men and women go to their tasks not because they're ordered there, or not because their fathers went there, but because they will make money there. And we take two very negative words, especially in America, all right? The first word is competition. Ooh, ooh. And in some of the more progressive schools, we no longer have athletics with their teams because everyone's a winner. It's like Lewis Carroll's The Caucus Race. All right, competition. And the second, of course, is that terrible word, self-interest. See that? Ooh. But Adam Smith, in 1776, and I think the most definitive book in economics has ever been written, The Wealth of Nations, he said this: let competition and self-interest go, and through the invisible hand of the market, they will produce socially beneficial results for not only the society, but for the entire world if you let them go. And the whole history of the 20th century and into the 21st century has been that that's true. All right? Now, you may disagree with that. That's fine, too. And there are a couple of other things I want to say about the market. One is by the great Austrian economist Joseph Schumpeter, who had this extraordinary expression: the gales of creative destruction. That the heart of the market system is not only productivity, but the, as Michael Lewis would say, the new thing. And don't we all live in that sort of a world? Look at what's happened in the world in the last 20 years, 30 years. I mean, when I was young, when Father Bian was young, we couldn't imagine what's just happened in the last 20 years. And this spring, an astronaut stood on this stage, and he said, oh, in 1,000 years, there's no question that we'll be flying to God only knows where on a regular basis. I said, oh, that's pretty interesting. But that's the idea. So at the heart of the system is the new thing, the gales of creative destruction. And as the two great Austrian economists, Friedrich von Hayek and Ludwig von Mises, put it this way, look, no matter how sincere you are, whether you are a pope, or whether you are a committee, or whether everyone in this room, we cannot possibly make decisions for 330 million people. We can't do it. And every time a group tries, whether they call themselves the Soviet Union, or Cuba, or Venezuela, or North Korea, they fail. In the 1960s, Czechoslovakia had a great boost. It had 15 tons of steel for every man, woman, and child in Czechoslovakia. But they didn't have enough underwear. And so you've got to be very, very careful, all right? So there's redistribution, and although, don't worry, I'm almost finished. But there is one thing I want you to listen. There was a book that came out about 40 years ago by Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan of New York, right? And it's a very naughty book because it was called A Dangerous Place. And that meant two things. The United Nations was dangerous and the world was dangerous. And if you would just listen for a moment, this is what Moynihan says. At the outset of the Second World War, there were three great cities on the Bay of Bengal, more alike than great cities usually are. Each had been founded by the British East India Company, and each was very much part of an international trading, English-speaking world. A generation later, the first Calcutta had become a necropolis, city of the dead and dying, vast, putrefying, forsaken. The second, Rangoon, had ceased to be a city and was rapidly reverting to the village it had once been. The law buildings and police headquarters where Orwell found an inadequate justice now knew none, and the rulers may have known that, for they had surrounded themselves with barbed wire and machine guns. The third city, Singapore, very possibly had the highest urban standard of living in the world. Calcutta, Rangoon, Singapore. Of liberty, Singapore had not nearly enough, but Rangoon had none at all, and what there was in Calcutta was less and less real as the mob grew. Something had made the difference. And what was it if not a rational liberalism in economic affairs? Singapore had committed itself to the creation of wealth rather than to its redistribution. Airy thoughts, no doubt, but the 500,000 human beings sleeping on the sidewalks of Calcutta were real. The latest issue of Vogue at the newsstands in the public housing of Singapore were real. The barbed wire around the law offices in Rangoon was real, as were the soldiers and the machine guns. It was the talk in the Indian Parliament that was unreal. Daniel Patrick Moynihan. And end by just saying that. And I would simply say one last thing. Economics, please do not place too heavy a burden on it. It is not a solution to the problems of the world. It is not a political solution. It is not a cultural solution. It can do what it does, and it can do it very well if it's allowed to. There's a lot more in the world. And I think that, in fact, that Pope Francis may very well be making a mistake when he's talking in terms of the poor, and I think instead of focusing on production, he focuses on redistribution. Now, that doesn't mean I'm against charity. I'm not against charity. I'm not against people giving. They should. It's part of the Catholic. We have to do if we're Catholics. But redistribution, the history of it, not so good. So thank you very much. It was very kind of you to listen.
So we'll have some time for questions now. I want to point out, since we had two speakers, please begin your question by letting us know who it's addressed to. You're welcome to ask a question that can be answered by both of our speakers. You're welcome to ask a question that's directed at what one of them said. Just let us know as you begin your question.
My question is for Elizabeth here. And first of all, I'd like to just say that it's a pleasure to have someone so young speak so articulately. And I really enjoyed your speech. I, too, am a liberal, a pro-life liberal. Probably not quite as liberal as you expressed, but I think the thing that was missing from your presentation is how you would redistribute the wealth.
You can. We got the microphone here, so you can just.
Perfect. I was trying to figure out where I should direct my voice. Well, the fantastic thing about Catholic social teaching is that it's not. Sorry.
All right.
I'm sorry.
I take that back.
A weak voice. Is that better?
Yes.
Yes. Thank you. So the fantastic thing about Catholic social teaching, and what I was trying to get at by quoting Vischer, is that there is no one way to do it. There is no implemented policy that comes in Catholic social teaching. It doesn't say, okay, so here's how you set up your tax brackets, and here's how you take the revenue. It just says, here's the moral parameters within which you need to manage your resources. So they go through different stages of development. Developed economies have different capabilities in terms of production than economies that are still developing or at very low levels of development. And an economy like the United States, where we have very high levels of production, where we're very developed, I would say that the way that you redistribute wealth is not simply with the goal of redistributing willy-nilly. It's not like let's put everybody on the same level of income, but you look at problems that you want to target and you set up programs around that. So one program that I am constantly trying to rep is a child benefit, that when a family has a child, instead of getting a tax credit, non-refundable tax credits exclude people who make very low levels of income, who need it the most. What you would do is you just send parents a $300 check, or once again, the amounts can be tinkered with, every month for the duration of their time raising a child. There are programs like this that are analogous in multiple countries. They exist already. They reduce child poverty. They have fantastic impacts on children's opportunity outcomes, children's health, children's education, marital stability. They're just really great programs. And that's one way that I would think of, to implement a redistributive policy. But no, I'm not advocating a USSR-style total state takeover of means of production or anything like that.
As a relatively new parent, I fully support this idea. Let's go here. There.
This is for either speaker, really. Would you agree with me that let's go to the principles of Catholic social teaching. As I've read the encyclicals, the social encyclicals, I find two from rerum novarum to Laudato Si. And these two are the preservation of the family. Rerum novarum is very clear about this. Sufficient for a workman to raise, a frugal workman, to raise his family. The second principle, it seems to me, that you find in all of them is the dignity of the worker, the dignity of work. In Quadragesimo Anno, there's this wonderful phrase of Pius XI. We turn things through production into magic, and the workers who produce these things, these magical things, are turned into things. I'm paraphrasing, but there's that. The lack of creativity, the rational, creative being. Whatever economic system to be judged good has to do this. Would you agree with that? Assessment of the encyclicals and voice.
Cliff first.
Yes, I would.
Agreed, yes. Yes.
All right.
I think those are the...
Guess we need more controversial questions.
Oh, wait, let me
Yeah,
process
sure,
a bit.
sure, go ahead.
So let me just elaborate just a bit. So here we are in the United States of America. Big company, Walmart. In the last couple of years, we hear that, especially, say, after Thanksgiving, before Christmas, all the employees comes to be 9 o'clock and they can't go home. No, we're going to decorate the whole store for Christmas. Yay! With no pay. That's just being part of the Walmart family. Personally, I think that stinks on ice. I don't mean to be. I think that's an absolute violation of everything the Catholic Church has ever said. And we've got to be very careful of that sort of thing.
All right.
So, I was hoping to get you all into a discussion. So if the system does those two things, what's wrong with it from the Catholic point of view? And if that happened in the Soviet Union, I've had people from the Eastern Bloc saying that those two elements were there in various circumstances, in various countries, and are not here. So,
Right. Well, the Soviet Union was like hosed up 6 ways to Sunday and again on Monday. There was a lot going on there, corruption-wise as well. But I had went to Brandeis University and I had friends.
corruption and those two things
Are there. Right. So there can be, so if you have a government that's heavily corrupt and it's running a really messed up railroad, but it respects the dignity of the worker and families are being preserved by a just living wage or family wage, whatever you want to call it, you still have the problem of corruption. And the work is humane. Then they have their economic house in order. But it's possible that there can be multiple problems in multiple segments, I think, of a state. That's why we have different areas of Catholic social teaching. You have Catholic social teaching as applies to people in economics and social teaching that applies to people and their political participation. One thing that Pope Francis does say on Laudato Si that I think is very important is that when you don't have those things, when you don't have respected workers, humane work, and work that allows you to preserve a family, you're almost guaranteed to have some form of corrupt governance and unrest. So while you might have a corrupt government and lots of unrest up at the top, but still somehow manage to pull off a reasonably good economic system, you can never have the reverse, where you have a terrible economic system but a good, strong government. So that's what I would point out about that. Third pillar.
Well, and without going into a long to-do here, But I disagree with them. The Soviet Union was a terrible... Look, in the 1980s, in Moscow, there was one cardiological unit. It was 5 stairways up. One. There was no milk. And when they finally, what finally brought them down was because the United States was spending 5% of its gross national product on defense. They were spending over 25% on theirs. They could not keep up. And Star Wars scared them to death. They did not have... I don't know where this is coming from, this idea of, oh, well, the Soviets... They did not have a just system. It was a terrible system for the average... And remember, it's the Soviets. I don't know any Russian, but they said, hey, they pretend to pay us, we pretend to work. And that's exactly... It was a terrible system. So I would say all the things that Catholic social justice stands for, the Soviet Union did not stand for.
I threw that out.
All right. Well, you
Thanks.
provoke.
Let's move on.
Yes.
Talk it out over hospitality, definitely. Over here. Yeah.
No.
Thank you both for your presentations, and either is welcome to comment on 2 observations, one economic and one philosophical. The economic observation is that, at least as Elizabeth quotes Pope Francis, markets make for an economy of exclusion that kills. Those are fighting words. Those are words that indict the economic system that over the last 100 years has proved to be the most successful at production. And in that regard, I would distinguish between the production of wealth and the distribution of wealth. Market economies have used scarce resources to produce maximum output far more effectively than planned economies have. And that's the economic observation. The philosophical observation plays off of the observation that Elizabeth made about human dignity and the perspective of personalism, and seeming to predicate Pope Francis's overall perspective on a personalist philosophical foundation. And I think that John Paul, as Karol Wojtyła, and Dietrich von Hildebrand, 2 of the great 20th century personalist philosophers, have strongly resisted the concept of statism and collectivism as depriving the human person of his individuality. Some would look to markets and assert, well, it's all about self-interest, greed, exclusion. John Paul in Centesimus Annus recognizes that in a market economy there is self-expression, creativity, and working at one's own workbench. That does not exist in the Soviet Union, and the real problem with the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc was the statist, collectivist view in which the individual was a finger on a massive hand, as opposed to an individual. So we're talking about not so much greed, but industry. Not so much self-interest, but self-expression and creativity. Not so much exclusion as self-sufficiency. And it's in that personalist perspective that Centesimus Annus, I think, was born and advocated. Now, as for distribution, John Paul absolutely agreed with the doctrine of common use, that the fruits of the system of production must be shared and at the disposal of the world's citizens. And that remains to be true. But the policy question of how one fixes poverty by either giving those resources to those to be consumed as fish, or going into those communities and figuring out a way for them to be productive and learn how to fish, is a very important policy question the nuances of which I'm not sure have been addressed yet by this papacy.
It always feels like madness when I talk about this stuff that I'm asked to defend the Soviet Union because it's the furthest thing from what I advocate. When Pope Francis talks about an economy that kills, he's not contrasting a planned economy with a market economy. That's a conflation of two different quotes. All he said was that markets don't self-regulate in a way that includes everyone. What he was contrasting was bad market economies and good market economies.
Even those words are not making sense. What does it mean to say that a market does not self-regulate to include everyone? Does that mean that they don't have the opportunity to apply for the job? Does it mean they're not well educated enough? But it's this sort of buzz lines that a market excludes and doesn't include everyone that has to be parsed and given content if the dialogue is going to be advanced.
Yes. Markets do not include everyone unless they are in some way tinkered with. Now, that's another thing. Markets don't exist independently of politics. The only reason that there is such a thing as private property, as Augustine pointed out, is because the government makes it so. Your property is not private property in any meaningful sense. This is Thomas Nagel's point in The Myth of Ownership, unless the government agrees to protect it for you. The police will come, blah, blah, blah. I mean, this is sort of spiraled into like a very large political science discussion, but to limit it back to the papacy, all I would point out is Pope Francis is not saying that we should incline towards a planned economy. Pope Francis is saying we should incline towards policies that mitigate the inequalities that develop in market economies that are not otherwise regulated. In terms of people who are left out of market economies, yes, people who are disabled, people who are mentally handicapped, people who are not good enough for the job or can't get educated for the job, people who are just weak, people who make mistakes, people who are failures, people who are bad and evil also deserve some standard of living and the repeated opportunity to flourish that mirrors the repeated opportunities for salvation that Christ offers us. Yes, that would be my view.
Let's go to the back. Oh, sorry, I missed Cliff. Cliff, did you have a response? No. Okay.
No, I'm just saying that people are starting to do this. I think
We're all going to get killed if we don't wrap this up soon. Okay.
That's what I'm...
Make it fast, Rich.
I will. I'll try to make it fast. I was at Mass this morning, and the reading was... I think it was the scripture passage about you can't serve God and mammon. And then, of course, there's other scripture passages that talk about the parable of the talents, right? Where it's actually a sin not to apply yourself and to work and bury your talents in the ground. I say that as a preface. Here's my question. Because I think Catholic social teaching is a lot more nuanced than maybe what we're hearing right now. Is the biggest problem poverty or inequality? And does it depend, and depending upon your answer to that, do the solutions to those things, are they somewhat kind of mutually exclusive or in tension with one another? Do you understand the question there? And then I guess my other part of the question would be, well, let's just go with that one.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
That's enough. Cliff.
All right. Well, sir, if I can answer very, very quickly, I'm for inequality. I think this whole business that we're in this country and all over the world, equality, it's nonsense on stilts, as Jeremy Bentham would say. What I do want is an equality of opportunity, not an equality of result, which we can never get. Could you imagine me playing football, for instance? That just don't even, it gets ridiculous. So that's just, we have an equality of opportunity, and what kind of society can, and that's a political, economic, cultural, so many things that have, but that's the kind of society I'm looking for. You know, I'll tell you just one other thing. Here's the kind of society I like. I like a society when a kid in Arkansas named Bill Clinton, who came from nothing, can become president of the United States and now I guess his wife is going to become president of the United States. And I'm shaking, but let's not go there. The point. Now, look, I will go any place for a joke, but so just look. This is supposed to be entertainment. But as long as we have a society when William Jefferson Clinton can come from nowhere, do what he's done, well, I'm for that society. But I'm not for equality. I mean, I'm for as much equality as you can get before the law, but that's about it.
Final word for Elizabeth. You stop. Yeah, it's inequality or probably a bigger problem. Well, let's let Elizabeth answer.
So I think there are problems on different registers. I'm sorry. I think there are problems on different registers. So I don't think they're exactly comparable in a way where it would make sense to pick between them. And I think to follow up on that, it has to do with the solution you propose, is that fixing inequality will affect poverty. And when you move to fix poverty, it will affect inequality, right? Because of the mechanisms that you use, like policies that do redistribute, they interact. So I would move to affect them together. I think that policies that affect one are probably going to affect the other. In terms of like grave human ills, it's very hard for me to say which one is more bad, because they're bad in different ways. Poverty affects lifespan, inequality affects social factors. Marriage, birth rates, abortion rates are associated with high inequality. Higher the inequality, the higher your abortion rate, etc. So it's hard for me to choose between them, but I do think that you're right in suggesting that the way that we fix one is probably going to impact the other positively.
Thank you to both.
Okay, thank you, Elizabeth.